I think we need to keep in mind the time factor. We have 20 minutes left. So we can have one or two general questions for all these speakers, and then we can invite members of the audience for some questions. Uh, Dilip began in a wonderful way, and it was bang on target, which was continued by other speakers subsequently, and that leads to what Dilip began by talking about spaces of intellection, and he concluded, as Leslie mentioned, with Foucault's comment on the intellection of subordinate knowledge spaces. So I think the bottom line that all the speakers start talking is this, that how in this traffic of knowledge, this flow of knowledge transfer, flow of knowledge and knowledge transfer, it is always the one-way traffic that we learn from the Western world, and there's no one to listen to us from different locations, speaking from different locations of the global South. And Katusa brilliantly used the term epistemicide in the context of genocide, the new coinage, which is very interesting. And she talked about the need for collegiality and carefulness. And Katusha also importantly raised the question of whether there is anything called neutrality, whether that is at all possible in this power narrative of the hegemony of the Western knowledge system. Something that was also continued in Pavan's note on the precarity of the migrant and how the right wingers are appropriating the narratives of the colonial thinkers. Pavan also talked about disenchantment and our enchanted solidarity with local actors who sometimes some of this led to some questions in the chat box also with the Kent School and Bala Gangadhara. But then there can be discussions and debates on that. And Diran concluded with all these views taken together, talking about the pluriverse that Dilip began with. Diran concluded with scientific pluralism, the pluriversality that Dilip introduced in the very beginning itself. That Diran mentioned about Booker T. Washington, who talked about the necessity of education, along with W.B. Du Bois in America, and also the Higgs boson in the particle and the problem in the physics, and Profundo Roy, the Hindu chemistry, and other great thinkers in the African American Caribbean thinking spaces. So taken together, I think we all would agree that all the speakers tried to emphasize on this factor that it's basically the problem with the flow of knowledge, that how certain ideas have dominated, and we couldn't emancipate ourselves from this colonial hangover, epistemic hangover. So I think this question is of paramount importance, that how to undo and how to reverse this trend. Dilip did mention about the university system in the global South, where we are, trained to train some clerks and the babus, and we are told that there are some students who will be doing science. We need not be focusing on the larger students for research and other activities. And Dilip and all the other speakers did talk about the publishing world, which is very important, because in the academic fraternity, in the academic world, to get the required recognition, you need to be published from big houses, university presses in America and Europe. That is the litmus test that you have to pass to kind of establish yourself as an important thinker. So there are many vernacular thinkers. Philip mentioned about his project of, he has already published his book, One Word from Different Vernacular Traditions, and how you engage with that concept, and how do you, proliferate with that concept, and how do you globalize, disseminate that idea across the globe. That is not happening. And when we talk about decoloniality now in a world torn with war, genocide, violence, to put it briefly, violence. It's a very violent world. And and that violence is triggered most of the time by this epistemic hierarchy, epistemic injustice. So how to undo that? How to effect that reversal, that we can create that level playing field where there will be a multiplicity of knowing and there will be two-way traffic. The people will learn from each other, collegiality that Katusha mentioned. And Dylan also talked about the plurality of knowledge systems, something that Pavan also hinted at. So I think this can be a common question to all the speakers, but how do you think in terms of a concrete measure uh, to reverse this trend? One way is, of course, to write and to engage and to organize conversations like this, because the more we do, the more we put up front these issues in the public domain. What are the other concrete ways where we can reverse this trend of imbibing knowledge from the West and learning from that and paying no attention to vernacular knowledge systems, the local reservoir of knowledge, which are very rich, but people do not know about it. So that can be one common question to all of you. If you would like to add to what you said in the beginning, that would be wonderful.
Thank you very much. Marissa, do you want to come in now?
Thank you, Leslie. I don't think I have the intellectual wherewithal to respond to all the speakers. Perhaps I have some questions, regarding this concept of, decoloniality and its processes. And I'd like to, put those questions in front of the panel so that we can have the discussion. First of all, I would like to congratulate Professor Dilip Menon for that wonderful book. You have not only just you're not only just talking about decolonization, you are showing how to do it. You are working with the words and generating concepts, and how those concepts can live with. How those concepts can uh, uh, read to the or can help us understand the praxis of of societies, non-Western societies. So congratulations on that. But my question is that and a worry also. In this processes of epistemic decolonization, sometimes what we see is that there is a move towards epistemic nationalism and epistemic majoritarianism. For example, I sometimes flip through the books on Indian philosophy written by many renowned scholars, and I see there are chapters on Buddhism, special, and of course on Vedic Hinduism and many scholars from that tradition. But there is hardly any mention of a Muslim intellectual, of Muslim philosopher. I don't understand why this is happening. If you read those two tomes by our Radha, by Radhakrishnan, there is hardly any mention of of the philosophical traditions coming out from the Muslims of India, Sufis and other traditions. So why I'm asking this, because uh, when Mr. Kapurokastra and we are engaged in a project called mapping minor intellectual traditions. So what happens is that often those minor voices, those intellectual traditions, they get sidelined and not represented. So how to address that? This is one question. The second question is the question of capital. Uh, I read the books by Aditya Nigam and other scholars who are talking about pluralizing the history of capital or capitalism in the non-Western setting, and they are talking about that capitalism should be viewed not as a mode of production but rather as a mode of uh, being. Uh, how? Because capitalism leads to this notion of positive individualism, which is perhaps against the understanding of being that is there in non-Western settings. But if we look at, countries like India, China, maybe also some of the countries from Africa, we see that there are, huge, hierarchies in terms of, economic uh, class difference. There are, rich sections and I mean, in a way, mostly the middle class, upper middle class, they are going for this, positive individualism, positive, yeah. But there are a large section of people who cannot even, think of that. So when we talk about, I mean, when we focus on epistemic decolonization, that is a very important point. But are we, sidetracking from the issues of material inequality and other things that are right now there in the post-colonial countries or post-colonial sometimes as Navembe calls. So second point, a third point, your critique of enlightenment thinking, that is definitely very important critique. But the point is that there have been sections in former colonies who use those ideals of enlightenment for their own kind of upliftment and empowerment. So, I mean, your take on that. And finally, the question of LIC, that Katusa and my friend Diran talked about. By the way, Diran, I think you know more about Bengal than me. So, yeah, so the question of LIC, how to build LIC, especially in an international setting of, international relation of power and, capital. That is an important point, perhaps. So these are some of the points that I am putting across to the panelists, and maybe we can have further discussion, questions from the audience. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So just to begin with, before we then open up, and I've got quite a number of questions in the chat, and also I've got a couple of people who've had their hands up as well, so I want to bring them in a minute or two, but I wanted just to ask the panel if they wanted to respond both to Anindya's response and also if they had any responses to Merced's questions around epistemic nationalities, around histories of capitalism, around critique of Enlightenment thinking, and the building of alliances. So there's actually quite a lot of questions in both of those responses. So who from the panel would like to have a first go at that? Katusha, can I bring you in? Katusha in.
Well, I think this, especially in terms of alliances, and there is a question, maybe two, on the chat that are very similar to that, like how we're consistent in building solidarity or building alliances. And also dealing with the contradictions of that, right? I believe that there are, like, in the colonial praxis, which is not just talking about being free from colonial power. I think Diran was very clear, like, okay, there is still African elitism, there is still coloniality of power present despite being under colonial power. So I believe that the colonial praxis that we are talking here is dealing with this ongoing negotiation, and it can never stop. The idea of having maybe a structure, a recipe, let's do this, this, and that, or let's wait for a leader, that will be the end of us, right? Because the point of equilibrium is always changing, and that ongoing negotiation, as we are recreating new possibilities of racializing people, for example, right? Or creating new possibilities of
Here's what I found.
Oh, sorry. My Siri is talking to me. I'm sorry.
It's all good.
Or having new identities, or new identities feeling more safe to come forward. For example, I just mentioned trans people. We can talk about non-binary people. We can talk about different ethnicities or people being racialized because of a particular religion now. I think 9/11 did this, especially for the Muslim community. So we need to be in this conversation, because otherwise the norm of decolonization will become the oppressions of others, because that's what we do when we stop a community or negotiating, right? The norm becomes the rule of othering, and that is the danger. I'm with all the provocations about how do we deal with the contradictions. Well, we sit with the discomfort. I think the idea of dialogue, or the idea of building communities, or building alliances and solidarity, is not that romantic. It is that challenge. It is that the difficult in which we discuss, as Audre Lorde taught us, and understand that there will be differences, and that the colonial might not be in one path. It should be actually in different paths or roads that we are going to pave, maybe not for this generation, but the ones to come. So that's why I was inviting for reflections for us to think about how we are doing that together, because the individual narrative is also, it takes us to take accountability, but also if we just remain in the individual, we'll fall into the capitalist trap that is isolating people. So that's why I also believe that collegial community building are practices that are important to be considered in this building of alliances. I hope I directly addressed to that.
Thanks very much. And the notion of sitting with discomfort, I think, is really important and powerful. Dilip, do you want to come in now?
Yes, actually, there were 5 or 6 questions that were raised, and I'll try and answer them again telegraphically, because we were trying to compress a lot into a very short time. What is the work before us? And I think there is this phrase that has come up, that of critical decoloniality. And the work before us really consists of, one, these trans-hemispheric conversations. And this is a phrase that I would like to use rather than these binaries of global north, global south, because we live in the age of global warming. The entire world is in peril right now, and we need to talk to one another. And these trans-hemispheric conversations, which is the premise of my first volume, where we brought together 21 scholars working with 16 languages, right? And that was the idea. To actually generate conversations across spaces. The second thing about critical decoloniality is to think about the inherited concepts that we work with. And this goes back to some of these questions about the internal hierarchies and the internal violence within the global south. So we think about the fact that we so loosely use the word Indian society, right? And one of the things is that Indian society is characterized by a lack of it, right? We are a inegalitarian, violent society characterized by caste and the denial of humanity to large sections of the population. So critical decoloniality has to begin with that. And this speaks also to the question that was raised by Katusha about the relation between the white and the indigenous in South America, and the who gets to be heard. The third question is that of the temporality, right? That we actually have to think about the now. And when we do our critical theory, we have to engage with the landscape of violence and hierarchy around us. And we also have to think about the fact that what Walter Benjamin called the yet site, the now time of theory, where we have to address the pressing concerns of the present. And this is an ongoing process. It's a long durée, the long temporality, as Katusha so beautifully put it. And what this means really is that we don't engage with a bad example. There were too many, I mean, the questions all brought up several bad examples. Robert Mugabe, and why should we be looking at the bad examples of work? We should be thinking about how we can do better work, and think about ways in which we can actually progress with decoloniality. Of course, there's a lot of bad work out there, and I don't care to engage very much with it. And the last point that I'd like to make is really that of the wonderful idea of conversation that Diran brought up, where he took up Tagore's poem, a poem that was written in the aftermath of the Italian conquest of Abyssinia in 1935, right? And it's interesting, the last words of the poem, where he says that pardon, comma, should be the message, the final say of your civilization to Africa. And I think that is a wonderful message in the sense that we, instead of hanging with the nightmare of the past constantly sitting on our shoulders, there is a way in which we should just say, we forgive you and move on and do our own work, which is what we are not doing now. There is a lot of work to be done. There is a lot of work to be done in terms of handling the internal violence in our societies, looking at traditions of intellection within our societies, generating concepts from our societies and saying the West doesn't matter, right? And in many senses, I think that delinking is important. And I think I'd go back to Pawan's dreadful pun with which he began, where he said that if you're studying Europe, it should be called urology, where he was really taking the piss, as it were, literally or metaphorically. And that's really what we should be doing with existing theory, taking the piss and doing our own work. And so I'll stop there.
Thank you. So I think that then cues you in, Pavan, to respond to that now nicely.
Yeah, and it's beautiful. I'm spot on with Dilip and others here, Katusha. I think one of the points Katusha mentioned is that the departure point of decoloniality now in our institution should be, it is not a secular rational thinking, it is thinking through discomfort and pain and disagreement, dissent should be instituted as part of our educational curriculum, not this safety, security, sanitized language. You know, this is the decolonization comes through a certain kind of pain, and that should be part of the conversation. I know that is a very important aspect. And also, what I'm fully with Dilip is that decolonization has to shift its coordinate, what he called these trans-hemispheric. And I also strongly believe that decolonization has to shift its coordinates strongly towards internal local hierarchies. These are of greatest concern to the most of the subaltern people, not just as important for intellectual, the historical decolonization is. And lastly, I mean, I stand by what I said, that we need more urologists in a sense who will dismantle all this methodological nationalism. But I would like to share one anecdote. You know, I spent a lot of time working with indigenous communities in Canada in the sector of literacy and education. One of the things that so totally frustrated me was that in the sense of political insularity within which these communities work, you know, I could barely strike a conversation about the people of plight.
We lost him.
I think we've slightly lost you, Pavan. Are you still there? Right, what I'll do is I'll bring Diran in and hopefully Pavan will come back before we get on to, we move to the wider questions. So Diran, do you want to come in and respond?
Yes, thanks, Professor Makara. Thanks. I think the 2 points that I'm in agreement with all the speakers. I'm very comfortable. The issue of allyship, you know, can easily be confused with issues of trusteeship, questions of sort of donorship, and so on. And I think I think that type of allyship can be patronizing and condescending. I think the allyship that's needed is the kind of allyship that allows people to do for themselves what all other people do for themselves. In other words, if you're an ally and you're part of a dominant group, whether internally or externally, first you should fight to stop the kind of oppressive practices that the group, the class to which you belong does. So so you're not helping the oppressed directly, you're preventing the injustice from where you stand. So I think the example of Einstein and Bose suggests that Einstein didn't write his paper for him. He just gave him the opportunity to express the idea that he thought was important to do by forcing journals to consider them. The second issue, so it's not well crafted, but that's the way I see allyship, as a partnership rather than a partnership to prevent injustice, a partnership to open up more spaces for the oppressed to express themselves rather than doing something for someone else. Then the other issue is the issue of decolonization, critical decolonization. Something I always used to test myself is, can I express in my African language a very eloquent, flowery concept in English or French or something like that? And if I'm struggling to find such a term in a way that that appeals to an intelligent person who's not predominantly European language educated, then I feel somewhat guilty that this is an alienated discourse. So, and I'm not suggesting that, but that's important. And so I think while decoloniality and critical decoloniality are important critical instruments, and I think we're all in agreement that there is a constructive aspect to it, I think that constructive aspect should probably have names that are embedded in the cultures and the languages and so on and so forth. So decoloniality can be a transhemispheric discourse, as Philip said, but then we need other names, Ubuntu, and other names that we can recognize that are not European language terms necessarily, but that reflect other worldviews, other imaginaries, and those should be part of our lexicon as much. So I'll leave it at that.
Thank you very much. Pavan, are you back in the room? I know you've got difficulty with where you're able to speak to us because of the difficulties of the institution today. No, okay. So thank you very much for your responses. I'm going to start now taking some of the questions from the chat. It is possible, somebody asked about whether we can unmute. I think the chair can actually unmute. It's an interesting power one has, can unmute some of the participants. If you wanted to ask your question, you could raise your hand and I'll try and bring you in. But I've got a gathered field of questions now. And some of them are sort of, as Katusha actually observed earlier, some of them are touching on similar kinds of themes. So I'm just going to kind of gather these together if I can. So there's quite a number of points being made about, I suppose, ideological misappropriation might be something that connects some of these things. So one is about reconciling the tension between the decolonial aim and the risk of ideological misappropriation that comes from Parth. And Parth is also asking about, or warning, I suppose, or questioning the potential for, if we start talking, and actually this is something that you were saying we shouldn't do, but talking about global south, global north, that there's actually a concern that the global south knowledges might start replicating some of the things that happened earlier in the global north knowledges about sort of, taking hegemonic control over knowledge, and actually that would be the wrong thing to happen. So that's a question. That's one set of questions that links into Amrita's question about how do you understand decolonial praxis with rising neo-colonial praxis, and that links into Khalil's question, I think, about how does extremism and majoritarian nationalism affect decolonialization. And then, so I'm going to link this then to another question, which is a really significant one. How can all of this then be applied to questions about how we support Palestinian liberation? So that's why I'm taking you through quite a number of concepts there. So what's your response? Who'd like to go first from the panel on that one? Katusha, please come in.
Hi, I can go maybe discussing something that Diran just said. I think allyship and showing up for people who are not necessarily part of your community needs to be led by them. And that's why the idea of how we show up for Sudanese people, how we show up for Palestinian people, how we show up for Black people, would need to be in their terms, right? And that's why the conversation is so beautiful between Black solidarity and Palestinian solidarity. When Black Lives Matter movement was happening in the US, for example, Palestinians sent information about what are the strategies to go on the street and deal with, you know, the gas bombs and the truculent violence of the police, because that's something that they had to think about in the everyday. And these are the things that Black communities were calling for solidarity in that moment, and that this is the kind of information they needed at the time. So it is not just on the terms of Palestinian people, but the knowledge they could share in that moment. I'm just giving this example because I think we can extrapolate to any group of people who are in need of that particular solidarity in that moment, and how we also can keep that solidarity in our praxis as a method. And I don't think that is the flattening of the term of decolonization, which is one of the questions there, especially because there is this movement, the need for this dialogue, this constant understanding of what we need, what each other can be. But when we do this, there is something that I wanted to say, and that's why I had the urgency of speaking, because I think that as much as we can bring or recover our history and recover the knowledge that has been ostracized or have been ostracized, I think it's a danger just to make romantic those who were colonized or those who were racialized or inferiorized as people who can do no harm. The things are complex, right? And I think that imagining a leader or imagining communities are in the global south, I'm going to use that term for the sake of this conversation. We can challenge that term later. I'm not really sure if that's necessarily reproducing binary, but we can talk about this, is that we cannot just expect those who have been subalternalized not to further subalternalize others. Because the way violence has been inflicted on us and naturalized on us for so many generations, and also because we are humans, we might fall into the traps of that naturalized language and belief that power exists in only one way. And therefore, we inflict harm on others. So until we get there and take accountability for the ethics of caring we deploy, we're going to be dealing with this negotiation, with this issue. So I just think it's dangerous that we just talk about, for example, the way I'm talking about Black people. I'm saying this and I'm using this as an example because I feel comfortable as part of my community. We have internal conflicts as well. The same way someone is saying that we have internal conflicts, or we should discuss internally the idea of the decolonial, because maybe we need to negotiate what we mean by decolonial. But while we're doing that, this term has been already commodified. And some universities are using, we are a decolonial university, or we have a decolonial curriculum, where that's not quite the praxis, but the marketing, right? And how they are selling those ideas. And so how some academics are also being disingenuous, if I can use that term, in how they have studied other things, and from one year to another, their career became something sort of decolonial. Where is the turn, and what is the praxis in the turn? So I think for the moment, I'm using the term decolonial, and it's also in the title of my job. I am a lecturer in race and decolonial studies. But I don't hold any, I don't appropriate this term as the decolonial is the real thing of the radical revolution, change for social justice. The decolonial is a state in which we're in this negotiation. But if tomorrow we, as a radical group for social justice, decide that we are going to use another name, so be it. For now, the queer is making sense. The global north and global south is making sense just to denounce how the world has been organized in a way that is subinternalizing some ideas or some knowledges or some presences. So even if we have westernized universities, for example, in Brazil, a university where I studied in a university that contemplated Chicago School of Sociology in empirical research, and that's how I was trained. I was trained based on a very US-centric understanding of sociology. And that's a very westernized way to see how sociology can be deployed, can be applied. Now, when I travel and go to the US, or when I'm here in the UK, I received already feedbacks from a student saying, oh, when I heard it was a Brazilian professor that was going to deliver the lecture, I didn't expect that it was going to be this brilliant. Well done. Please take this as a compliment. They don't expect me to be brilliant, because despite I studied in a westernized university, I come from the global south. So those terms are helping us to understand or to operationalize how the order or the colonial order in the world was imposed. But again, if those terms don't work anymore, drop it like it's hot, like Snoop Dogg already said. We don't need to use them. We can use different terms. The most important thing, just to close, is not to essentialize any of these ideas. They can just be concepts to help us think critically and engage ethically or with a careful intention to situate knowledge and to acknowledge existences that have been dehumanized. But they are just concepts. The most important thing is the language, right? How we disrupt this power in this negotiation. So learning Ubuntu, what Ubuntu means, learning what Sankofa means, or even learning what Quilombo means. Because Quilombos in this traditional Black communities in the Brazilian context that live for more than 300 years, they remain alive in Brazil. Every time that I write a project to ask for a grant, I have to use at least half of a page to explain what Quilombo is. And I have to lose most of the space explaining to probably a white bureaucrat to read and understand what I'm trying to say, right? But these are the negotiations that I do intentionally. But it's still, I'm not as in an equal position as another scholar who are just researching other mainstream kind of communities. And I'm saying mainstream because it's in the mainstream language. So I'm here in this intentional negotiation of how, even if you use the English language, how we change the meanings of those concepts, right? And that's what I'm very dedicated, and I hope we can do that. I'm sorry, I spoke for too long, but I'm
Thank you very much, Katusha. No, that was really, really insightful. Dilip, do you want to pick up on some of the themes that Katusha and the questioners have been asking around these issues?
I don't want to take up any more time. I've answered all the questions in the chat.
Yes, okay, fine. Dhiran or Pavan, if you're still there, have you got anything you would like to add just now? And then I'm going to move on to the next question. Dhiran, have you anything you'd like to say? You're fine. And I think we've lost Pavan. I hope he comes back. So I'm going to actually ask you to address Karubaki's question, which is, thank you so much, lots of lovely comments in the chat. Key takeaway for me was intersectionality of decolonial praxis. I'm a master's student in colonial and post-colonial studies, and my question is, how can academia, specifically professors, actively promote and support integration, challenge traditional pedagogic paradigms and forge innovative approaches to address epistemicide, epistemicide. Do you see experimental learning, maybe experiential learning as a tool within the delinking that can help attain this pluriversal allyship? So it's about the modes of pedagogy within the academy and whether experimental or experiential learning can act as a tool within that. So Diran, can I start with you?
This is in relation to the master student.
Yes, yes.
Okay. I will pass. I'm not sure I'm in a good position to answer that one.
Okay. Dilip, do you want to come in?
As I said, I'm answering it in the chat function. Every
Oh,
question that I asked has been answered and people have been reading it, because I think speaking takes up too much time.
okay, sorry. So you have answered it there. That's fine. Katusha, have you got anything else you'd like to add to it?
I'm sorry, I got a little bit confused. Which question are you asking?
I'm on Karabaki's question, which is from a master's student in colonial and post-colonial studies, who's asking about challenging how we can actively support integration and challenge traditional pedagogic paradigms. So this is about how we teach and forge innovative approaches to address epistemicide. And do you see experimental learning as a tool within the delinking that can help attain this pluriversal allyship? It's actually quite interesting when you're talking about a student response to a Brazilian lecture, which is quite terrible. But, you know, so from a pedagogical point of view, yeah.
We just finished a project at the University of Edinburgh called Radical Pedagogies that is exactly addressing two innovative, creative, different approaches to anti-racist education. So we don't talk just about liberation, because sometimes even the concept of liberation has been decontextualized to a more mainstream approach. So we are very intentional in saying that. There is a toolkit from this project that we are discussing. We have a vocabulary, and I think it can be helpful because we are talking about using drama, the theater of the oppressed. I don't know if you heard of this from Boal. We are also talking about the pedagogy of the oppressed from Paulo Freire, from bell hooks, and Abdias Nascimento, who was also very inspirational in discussing the theater of the oppressed. So there is a combination of different authors that is not something new. They have been pushing this agenda that is trying to bring different conversations to the classroom as a radical space for transformation. And I believe this can be, I don't know, helpful for a dialogue somehow. It's not a recipe, but it's a toolkit for you to develop it in the classroom, and maybe can be helpful for the future. Of course, this project was developed with Quilombo communities in Brazil, so it is important to contextualize, but I think this is I believe in education. My family is of generations of educators, music teachers, yoga teachers, teachers of physics, and sociologists as me, football teachers, and I'm very proud to say that education has been part of the legacy that it was passed on to me. So thank you for your question.
Thank you very much. So I've been just noting that actually Dilip and Diran have been going through all the questions and answering the questions, and so slightly closing down the conversation in relation to some of these points through the panel. So I don't want to sort of raise those again. And I think we're sort of, I mean, I think in terms of pedagogy, I think what you're saying, Katusha, is actually really fundamental. One of the things that I've been working on at the moment through ICE, we're trying to get funded, is a network with Kolkata and with in Accra in Ghana around women's leadership in education and politics. And we are part of that proposal initially was to use the sort of theatre of the oppressed as one of the methodologies that we might use to explore concepts of leadership and global leadership. And so I think sometimes these sort of more imaginative and also modes of pedagogy that actually fundamentally address notions of power and how that power is deployed can sometimes sort of open up sort of new thinking and move knowledge on. So I think I'm really great actually. Sorry, I'd love to have a coffee with you, Katusha, just to talk about that further. But those kind of methodologies can actually really be transformative. Because one of the things, going back to something that you said, Dilip, and I'll come back to you in a second, is at the beginning about the nature of the university and universities themselves as institutions and as you know, curators, purveyors of knowledge are actually really fundamental to how we might be able to change the world. And it's actually changing the university might be one of the places where many of the things that are happening globally are things that we have it's very difficult to have influence in many ways, but we do all have spheres of influence. And many of those spheres of influence belong within the institution that we work in. And I think it behoves all of us to be actually trying to transform the institution, how it works and its practices and what it does. As a sort of fundamental beginning point of how we disrupt and change knowledge. So I have an optimistic view of what institutions could be, although not many of them are actually in that kind of form as yet. And I think it's, you know, using our spheres of influence to try and make that transformation, I think would be important. So David, do you want to come in there again? Yeah.
Yes, thank you. I mean, my cat was affording me a great deal of human-animal interaction here as I spoke, which but with regard to pedagogy, I think that we have to move beyond the university, and because universities are really mausoleums, that's where knowledge comes to die. I mean, this is really my feeling, right? And where there is an ossified state of knowledge where classrooms are about teaching what existed in the past. Classrooms are not engaged with what students bring to the classroom. Every lecture has to be different. Syllabi have to be created for classrooms. Syllabi shouldn't precede classrooms. These are all the ways in which I think about teaching. But with regard to pedagogy, I think one of the things that I was doing over the past few years is organizing these Theory from Africa workshops, which brought together young graduate students from Africa, and we did it in different locations. We did one in Beirut, which brought in students from West Asia, because the conversations that are necessary, if we think about new knowledge for a new generation, cannot happen between us, right? It has to happen with people who are 18, 19, 20, who are engaging with the world differently, and we have to actually create the spaces for those conversations, and which are not happening in the university. University is a space of supervision, tutorial, lectures, right? It's not the space for free thinking. So the Theory from Africa workshops, and the other thing that we've been doing over the last 10 years with the University of Tübingen are these Global South workshops, where again, students come from different parts of the world. And interestingly enough, and this goes back to something that Katusha said, I just returned from the session in Tübingen, which happened last month. There were students from South America, Africa, and so on. But since the theme of the conversation was indigeneity, apart from Spanish, French, German, English, and one or two African languages, we also had Quechua, Guarani, the languages of indigenous people, so which forced us into a conversation, right? Where English wasn't the master language at all. There were few of us who knew English, and that didn't help us any, right? So I think that is the kind of pedagogy we need to envisage, where pedagogy is a struggle, right? Where we really have to think about a communication beyond syllabi, a communication beyond the monolingual university, where we create spaces of conversation, because conversation proceeds not from the brain and the mouth, it proceeds from the heart. And that's what we need to try and achieve. And that's the space of true conversation. But you've got me onto my hobby horse, so I shall stop.
Yes, but we can help to make that change happen. So we do have some sphere of influence to make that happen. I think the notion of flipped classrooms and things that, you know, sort of disruptive forms of knowledge are really, really important. But we can enable that because we have capacity to just be radically different in our institutions. At least if we don't, we could actually create movements for that. So I think that's a really interesting point. So you get me onto my soapbox in a minute too. Diran, have you got anything you want? Because I've got another question that I want to draw out from the chat in a minute. Diran, is there anything you'd like to add? I don't know I think we've lost Pavan completely. I'm sorry. If you're there, please come back, but I can't see you. Diran.
Yeah. Well, I guess I'm not as senior as some of you, so I've been a traditional
Don't be
lecturer
ageist
so far.
here, Dhiran.
Well, I'm just giving due respect to the depth of knowledge and experience. But there is a workshop at Bits Rural next month, well, in July, which is about innovation in rural areas. And it's about space. It's organized by the School of Architecture and Planning, and I've been invited to it. And it's about learning through the environment or in the natural environment and through the natural environment. And I think getting out of the classroom, the four walls, as much as is feasible is part of that. So that would be my 2 cents.
Yeah, no, I agree with that too. So the question I want to just bring in, and maybe the final one, because we've been, you know, running out of time slightly. This is from Risha Biswas, so says, thank you so much for a thought-provoking session. In recent times in India, some instances in the name of decolonization, revival of traditional culturalism takes its snide way in different forms. For example, the controversial ban of women's entry to temples for protecting essentially community culture or other illogical gender balances going on, promoting the ideology of securing national culture and heritage. So again, this goes back to this thing about, you know, enchanting futures, but actually sometimes these things go slightly wrong, something that you were sort of alluding to as well, Katusha. How can we counter this type of menacing and revivalist form of cultural nationalism, defostering in the name of decoloniality? So what are the practical steps then that we can do to challenge this?
I think the larger fight is really against the rise of a certain kind of Hindu majoritarianism in India, which is appropriating forms of knowledge. And curiously enough, as I pointed out in the chat function, what we have is an ironical instance of a seemingly decolonial enterprise which draws upon colonial knowledge. Because if we think about the early Orientalists like Colebrook, William Jones, etc., in the 18th century, who created this idea of Hindu knowledge as being kind of the lodestone of civilizational knowledge. And they translated Shakuntala, which made its way to Germany, which was read by all the Germans, introduced. And so Goethe begins to talk about the idea of world literature at that point. Hegel's philosophy of world history is actually a reaction to what he sees as an Indophilia, which is happening, which is leaching German original thought. So there are all of these histories, but the fundamental fact behind Orientalism was to speak about Hindu knowledge in order to devalue what went before, the Islamic inheritance. So it was the British who came, colonized India, spoke to a vanquished people about their past, not their present, certainly not their future, spoke to them about their past and delegitimized the Muslims whom they saw as conquerors who came from outside. Unlike the English, the Muslims stayed in India for 400, 500 years and contributed to Indian civilization. It's interesting that the BJP and the Hindu majoritarians now pick up the Orientalist enterprise and worship the artifacts of colonial knowledge. This is what we need to fight against. This is what we need to expose. So it's like that old Gresham's law, bad money drives out good, bad knowledge drives out good. And that is the space we are in. And as students and as academics, we need to fight this. And anyway, I mean, but that's the important thing here, that this is being appropriated. Yes, it's being appropriated. It's being appropriated in Latin America. Decoloniality is being appropriated in Africa. It's become a new form of hyper-nationalism, right, which excuses a ruling elite from the perversions that they practice within a democratic society. So I think this is something that is a much larger fight, right? A much larger fight against a creeping authoritarianism, a creeping fascism, and a creeping, in India, a creeping retrenchment of the inegalitarianism of caste.
Sorry, yes, I've unmuted myself, sorry. Katusha and Diran, have you got any further response to make to that? Katusha,
Do you
no?
want to go, Katusha?
First, Diran, yes, and I'll bring.
Yeah, so I think what I would like to say is that, and I'm just going to speak for African philosophy and in African languages as well as in other languages, is that there is an internal there's an internal critical discourse. So when you have a populist political leader who tries to describe what African culture should be and why everyone should do this and should do that, I think that removes the element of talking back, of answering back, of probing, of looking at things from multiple angles. So yes, I understand that some of that is inherited from colonialism, or much of it, but there is also historically, the gender struggle in my Yoruba culture. It's not that we figured out gender balance or the balance between the sexes from time immemorial, but we struggled through it. We had failures, we had successes, and upon reflection, we say these are probably the better ways to go about this. And so there's a reflexive exercise that even if you excluded an external intervention, has been carried out, and we need to take that internal discourse more seriously. And that would be, in my view, one way to challenge those who want to exploit it and take out, ad hoc in an arbitrary and self-serving manner, fragments of culture that are self-serving. It's a whole, and there are many facets of it, and we can even have an internal discussion, and then of course then talk about the extent to which external influences distort or favor or restore balance. So I think we should take our epistemology seriously. I think that would be a fundamental starting point, so that their diversity, their nuance, their contradictions can be available for discourse for those who can participate in that kind of discourse. So that would be my view as a way to challenge internally people of our countries or our nations or our cultures who want to exaggerate one aspect at the expense of other countervailing or counterbalancing ideas.
Thank you very much. And we've now lost Dilip, who's had to go and feed the cat, this lovely cat, and drop his daughter at university for rock climbing, so he's sending his apologies. Katusha, is there any final point you would like to make? Maybe a final rounding up point as well.
Yeah. Thank you, everyone, for being here to this hour. I really appreciate all the questions and the beautiful exchange we had in the panel. I just wanted to say, and this was actually to Dilip, to say, I'm not really sure if I would discard so much the importance of the universities, especially because nowadays it is still a structure of power that is relevant for us to get funds and send to different communities. I would like to see Dalits in my classroom. I would like to see indigenous people in my classroom. I would like to see Black Brazilians in my classroom. But whenever Brazilian people come to my office and they are in exchange or they have the means to fund an international fees in this university, they are going to be white, from white elite in Latin America. So I would like to have that structure changed as well. And I do believe that that's possible. So I just wanted to say that the classroom as a radical space of transformation can be anywhere. And from a Paulo Freirean perspective, adopting this idea that we can be potential educators in our everyday is in you know, the church, the praying circle, the reading group that you are doing, everywhere can be a small opportunity to have a classroom. By that, I'm not trying to wash down the importance of those formal institutions in which we can change and challenge and disrupt power. In many of the conversations I had with Jiran, maybe not enough, but long conversations in which we discussed something that he pointed out. When we are reflecting on this, how to disrupt power, we need to remember that even our communities, we have issues with power. They reproduce hierarchies, and we need to address them internally. We need to address them using the language and epistemes that are not just coming from elsewhere or imposed on us, but by us, and in this intention to build these careful spaces so people can actually make mistakes and learn from them and not be canceled or not having this kind of a further violent exchanges. So yeah, I just think it's important for us to address or not romanticize the communities that we are trying to bring to at the center that had been marginalized before. So thank you, everyone. I think it was a wonderful exchange, and I hope we can have future conversations, that this was never meant to be the end point to talk about decoloniality or those practices.
Thank you very much. So I think we now really have to draw the roundtable to a close, and I just want to thank warmly again all our speakers, and also a warm vote of thanks to Merced and India for organising this event. So I just want to say thank you very much again. And I just just before I hand back over, just a few final words. I think for me, it has to be the start of discussion and conversation, and it's not, it can never be the end. As you pointed out, Katusha, there's a sort of an ongoing negotiations. It's never, in some level, this is not ever going to really be accomplished, certainly not anytime soon. We've always got to be critical of the kind of power structures and through which we have to navigate our lives. But what it's enabled us to sort of reinforce, I think, is a sense of sort of common humanity, and common humanity in the face of really terrible things that are happening across the globe today, in Gaza, in Ukraine, in Myanmar, and South Sudan, everywhere. There are so many places where there's war and genocide and disruption. And I hope that we've found this conversation today to be informative and inspiring. And I think we all bear a collective responsibility to make the case for peace and justice and love, essentially. And I think hearing the brilliant research and the sort of wonderful ideas that people have been talking about today actually gives me, and our brilliant panelists, it gives me real hope for the future, actually. But we have to keep talking, we have to keep challenging, and we have to keep reflecting on what our own sphere of influence can be. So thank you very much again, everyone, for participating. Thank you for all the great questions. And I'm going to hand back now to our organisers to do the final closing. So thank you.
Thank you, Leslie, for the end remarks. So yeah, it has been really a fascinating exchange, as all of you mentioned. And as Katusha said, that this is definitely not the end of the conversation. We look at it as a kind of a beginning, and we hope that this will, the conversation will continue. And we also thank Leslie, Dilip, Katusha, Dhiran, and Pavan, and Dr. Shati Guha also. So on behalf of Murshid and me, we thank all the participants and for the questions and making this entire conversation and exchange of ideas possible. And we hope that in future again we will meet and our conversation will continue. Thank you, everyone.